And just a reminder for those watching who are looking for religious content, I don't do apologetics on this channel. I do cuss. I do say bad words, so just FYI. Welcome to Alpha Centurion. I'll be your guide. So today we're going to be talking about nuance, specifically as it relates to politics and religion. Two of the great taboos of cordial conversation. So I actually recorded a very similar video to this about 2 months ago after a discussion with BrainBug on Lady Adven's channel. I never got around to posting it, basically because it just took too much editing to get everything together. Hopefully I will post this one. So I was part of let's not call it viral, because it, maybe not that many people, but I was part of a little dust up, a little shit show that happened. But a guy named the Raging Atheist got a little heated. But there was a topic just before that happened that set the groundwork for it. And I would like to talk about that here, because I'm friendly with most of the people on this specific channel that I was on. And someone who was on, they may have been drinking a bit, but they decided to use some debate bro tactics instead of keeping it a friendly conversation. Setting it up into a false dichotomy using extreme examples to where you either have to defend an extreme, a ludicrous extreme. And I think Vosh also does this to some of his interlocutors as well. Or you have to deny your own position. So it forces you into that kind of position. And I didn't take the bait. And so Rage came in, and when the conversation switched to Islam, he was already aggravated because he and another guy were laughing about how the last time they did this to a Christian, how they kind of felt bad about that. So he was kind of revved up, right? So what happens when religion and politics meet? Well, with Rage, what happened is that he got very aggressive with I'm guessing female, with a female guest on the show, who was just trying to say that all religions, and I didn't catch it the first time when I was actually in the debate. I didn't catch what she was saying. I had to rewatch it a few times for me to actually catch what she was saying. She was saying that even if the theological basis of a specific religion is good, eventually the extremes will win out, simply because when that religion becomes the dominant form of political power, the extremes will take over. I don't agree with that, just to be clear. I don't think that a specific political party, no matter what its beliefs, has to be overtaken by the extremists. I don't believe that's how politics work. I don't want to believe that's how people work. But I understood her point after listening to her say it multiple times. But the first time, I didn't quite catch it. That was just on the subject of Islam and women's rights. Let's back up and look at some other hot topics. Abortion, feminism, gay rights, trans rights, immigration, and the death penalty. So, and I want to use Joan of Arc as an example here, because you can say that Joan of Arc is an example of feminism. You can say that Joan of Arc is an example of gay rights or maybe trans rights. You could say that she's an example of why the death penalty is wrong. She was killed, put on trial and killed for following her faith. And later she was sanctified and made a saint in the Catholic Church. Now, obviously, the Catholic Church doesn't think that she represents these things. The Catholic Church doesn't view her as a icon of feminism, or an icon of trans rights, or an icon of gay rights, or as even an icon against the death penalty as an example of why it's wrong? Or maybe they do. Okay. So it's really simple. There are certain things in the Catholic Church that will never happen. So what's impossible and why? You're never going to have female priest. It's not going to happen. Paul and Jesus have set some certain rules, and also through the tradition of the Levitical priesthood, it's just not going to happen. Okay, what about, okay, so that strike against feminism right there, right? A woman will never be on equal ground with the Pope or with a bishop because she'll never hold that position of power. Again, that's from a feminist standpoint. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just using the example, the extreme example. And I'll get into the possibles in a second. Right now I'm talking about the impossibles. Abortion. A lot of people like to say that there's that the bitter water in the Old Testament is some kind of metaphor for abortion, but it's not. It's actually, if you read the commentary, especially the Jewish commentary from the rabbinical fathers, you will see that it's actually a way to diffuse a heated situation. Basically, the bitter water never worked. But aside from placating an angry husband, abortion will never be allowed inside the Catholic Church. Why? Because going back to the foundations of the Church, not to the Bible by itself, but to the Didache, to the Shepherd Hermas, and to other Church Father writings, there are explicit wording that says that abortion is immoral. So no, abortion will never be allowed by the Catholic Church. Okay. What about gay rights? Well, you have the writings of Paul. And no matter how many Leos in the world want to say, well, how do you know that Paul was really speaking to God? The Bible is inspired. If you're a Christian or a Catholic, you believe in that inspiration, especially if you hold to orthodoxy or tradition, or orthodoxy and tradition, sacred tradition. So in that case, because in the Bible itself, in the words of Paul, homosexuality is not an activity you're allowed to participate in. It's not going to be sanctified it's not going to be allowed in the sense of gay marriage. It's just not going to happen. One man, one woman, Adam and Eve. So the Catholic Church will not allow that within the church. What about outside of the church? That's a different question. We'll get into the possibilities in a second. Right now we're talking about the impossibilities. So homosexual marriage inside the church, not going to be allowed. Trans rights. In the Bible, again, this is more about possibilities. We're not going to get into it deeply yet. But in the Bible, one of the first non-Jewish, or one of the first Gentiles who are converted is the eunuch. And even Paul says one of the highest forms of piety, one of the highest expressions of faith is to be a eunuch for God. But you're not going to get a group that holds Adam and Eve to be true, regardless of what truth means in this context, to agree to the idea that someone can change genders. And you're not going to get them to agree to there being a transitional gender. Maybe scientifically you can say that the XXY or the XXX or some other combination of chromosomes might lead to other expressions of sex, I should say. But they're still going to say that people are originated through nature. And I know that some people like to call it the naturalistic fallacy, but that's the argument, is that through nature, people are, or their ordination is to procreation. That's the example of a functioning That's the goal of survival. The goal of evolution is survival. Therefore, the natural goal of life is to procreate. Okay? Now, I know that doesn't seem to have anything to do with trans issues now, because trans issues have now become queer issues, and now you can have someone who was assigned to birth or born a certain way, transition, and now, even though they're in what would look like to the outside world as a male-female relationship, and they can get pregnant and everything, within the relationship they identify as queer. I get. Okay, that's not what we're talking about. We're just talking about the church recognizing these things. It's not going to happen. Okay. So, what about immigration? The church believes that every nation has the right to recognize. Every nation has the right to recognize borders and the right to its own security. So you're not going to have open borders through the Catholic Church. What about the death penalty? The church believes that every nation has the right to define laws. Does that equal a right to capital punishment? So let's talk about the possibilities. Going back to before liberal theology was a thing in the Catholic Church, there have been Catholics who have held that just as slavery is wrong, just as racism is wrong, so too is the death penalty, because it takes away one's opportunity to reform and go back to Jesus. And the examples of this are A, the thief on the cross who repents at the last minute gets into heaven, and B, Jesus himself who was crucified by the state under capital punishment. That's one example of a church teaching that has changed. So now let's look at, so again, we're looking at what's possible. Immigration. So there is a rule in the church that we are to love everyone. Trans people, immigrants, Gentiles, Jews, tax collectors, pagans, atheists, murderers, thieves, sinners, because we're all sinners and we're called to love like Jesus loves. Jesus died for us, so we should love everyone without judgment. Period. The immigrant, the murderer, someone who commits abortion. We're supposed to love them without judgment. Okay. So the church has an active arm in helping immigrants immigrate into countries so that way they can better their circumstances. And they do this throughout the world. Okay. What about trans rights? Well, the church isn't going to check if you're trans when you come into the church. They just want you to attend. The problem, and I tried to say this debate that I was in, is going to be when it gets to the sacramental life. There are certain sacraments, depending on how you identify as relates to your birth gender, to what you were assigned at birth, however you want to word it, that could cause problems. So if you take a vow of chastity, it probably won't even be an issue. But if you don't take a vow of chastity, then there could be issues when it comes to receiving the sacraments, marriage, and communion. It wouldn't stop you from going to confession. It wouldn't stop you from attending Mass. But it would, depending on if there's the word that we use is scandal, but it's not scandal like we mean today. Basically, if what you're doing will tempt someone else to sin, then you don't do it because you don't want to tempt someone to commit a sin. So even if what you're doing is not wrong, if someone else could perceive it as wrong, it could perceive it as wrong. The church usually either frowns upon it or encourages you not to participate. So let's get into gay rights. LGBT issues. The church, while it will never accept gay marriage, it will never sanction gay marriage within the church, that doesn't mean that it can't allow for civil unions outside of the church, because the covenantal law is that if you're in the church, if you're in the covenant, you have to follow the rules of the church. But if you're outside the covenant, if you're not of the Jewish people, you can do what you want. It's only if you choose to come into the covenant If you choose to be grafted into the vine, that you then have to follow the rules. So why do we follow the Old Testament? Because that's what was given to the Jewish people, and we are the descendants of the Jewish people. We are grafted in. We are adopted sons of God. Okay? So we're drafted into the communion, into the unity of the Jewish people. So the Jewish people have their own covenant with God. Christians have a new covenant with God. Okay. So what about feminism? Well, okay. So you can't have women priests, but it is possible to have women deacons. Why? Because in the Bible there are women deacons. The problem comes over the debate on what the word deacon meant in the New Testament at the time of its writing versus what the term deacon means now. So you could have a deaconess. Or a solution that I've always liked is that you could bring the nuns into the church. Nuns, N-U-N, not the other nuns. Not the non-believers, but the nuns, the women who take a vow of chastity, a vow of poverty to join the church, to consecrate themselves to God. They could have official roles. They could do the readings, not the gospel reading. They could help with the extraordinary ministry. They could help with the handing out of communion. They could have official roles within the church. That would be great. It would be awesome to have the father and to have a mother superior involved in the activities of the liturgy. Now, I don't know if there's some bylaw that says that can't happen, but that would be awesome if there was the ability for the nun to have an active role in the church and to have her be funded by the church. That would be great. Again, I'm not saying for her to take a part in the liturgy where she's not allowed to, not where a lay person can't, but roles that a deacon can take, or deaconess can take, roles that a lay person or extraordinary minister can take. Instead of have it be extraordinary ministers, have it be done by the nuns. Okay, so on the feminism side, there is a way to edge a little closer to the kind of equality that is recognized by the secular world, so that we don't scandalize the secular person who wants to join the church. Okay, now, what about abortion? So, like I said earlier, abortion's never going to be allowed in the church because it goes back to the foundation of the church. But what about in the secular world? Like I said, outside the covenant. It is the Christian's job to evangelize, to spread the word. But it's also the Christian's job to be merciful and to be understanding and compassionate. So while we could never allow it within the church, we could make laws that put limits on abortion, and we could promote those laws. Now, that's not to mean that the politics have to agree with the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church could be completely minimalized in politics, but the Catholic Church is still going to hold to its rules. But we could promote the idea of only in cases of rape, only in cases of invalidability of the child. So let's say the child's going to be born without a head. Well, there's no point in taking that pregnancy all the way to term. In circumstances where the mother will absolutely die, or where the pregnancy can't hold, genetic incompatibility, stuff like that. So there are places where, even though we could not allow it in the church, we could promote outside of the church a sort of minimalist allowance for the extremes. So here's just an example that I've heard from Jimmy Akin. We can't allow the pill in Christianity, but yeah, in Catholicism. But we can allow someone to take a pill. So for instance, birth control to regulate heavy menstrual cycles. Like menstrual cycles that would actually kill the woman. To prevent that situation, you can let the woman take the pill under Catholic bioethics. I'm not talking about in political, secular world. I'm talking about in the Catholic world. So even though while we couldn't even give an inch, we could show compassion going outward into the secular world. Not inward into the Catholic world, but outward to the secular world. We could, not so much concessions, but allowances, show compassion and say, look, these are the limits that are compatible with secular politics, but we wouldn't be happy about. And we would never allow it within the church. The only other really big one that we missed was married priest, but that is a custom and a discipline, not a dogma. This went a little bit longer than I wanted it to. And again, think of Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc is the prime example of how in the moment in her life and in our anachronistic way of looking back at history, where we're putting everything into presentism. Look, I get it. From our point of view, she represents a lot of things. From her point of view, she was a faithful Catholic, following God's commands to help save her nation. Piety. And she was killed for it by her government. And her government, in some versions of the story, were doing it because they thought they were protecting the church. Incorrectly. And the church told them not to. The church was on Joan of Arc's side at the end. And she was sanctified eventually. In the same way, while certain concessions can never happen, and certain stances within the church are not possible, the way that Catholics are taught to love, the way that Christians are taught to love and accept, we are taught to love you regardless of your sins, whether you're a murderer or whether you're a thief. We're taught to love you regardless of your inclinations, whether you're a naturalist or you're someone who believes in intuition. Regardless of your philosophical inclinations, we're taught to love. So when it comes to things like gay rights, feminism, trans rights, it doesn't matter where you stand, we still love you. We're supposed to love you. And if you have a parent who's rejecting you, they're not following God's command. If you have a parent who's hurting you or someone who's hurting you because of your natural disposition, they're not following God's command. Their command is to love you and accept you. And if they won't love you and accept you, then I love you and accept you. And you're welcome on my channel anytime. Regardless of whether or not you identify as trans or not, regardless of whether or not you identify as queer or not, regardless of any of that, you're always welcome on my channel. And I love you and accept you for who you are. Because that's the command of God. That doesn't mean I'm not going to evangelize. That isn't going to mean that I'm not going to tell you, hey, you should follow God. Hey, you should give up everything and follow God. And that means give up everything. That means choosing not to have sex outside of marriage, period. Choosing to be a eunuch for God, not having sex at all. Choosing to give up your male or female identity to have an identity as a bride of Christ. The priest sees themselves as married to the church. The church is the bride of Christ. So we're not telling you that you can't have the inclinations that you have. We're telling you that we love you regardless. Now, join Christ, give up everything, and be perfect, like your God, like your Father in heaven is perfect. That's what we're telling you, because that's what Jesus told us. And that's what Jesus told us to tell everyone. God loves you. Now, give up everything. Follow him.